Total War Warhammer is one of the simplest games in the Total War franchise, yet it's one of my favourites. It's so different from Shogun, and yet it really works with what it's trying to accomplish. I want to start by exploring how we got to Warhammer and how Rome 2 has continued to shape the franchise for better and worse. I think Three Kingdoms can seriously learn a lot from the Warhammer games as a lesson in where to focus in on strengths and where to avoid diminishing returns. Playing Rome 2 and Shogun 2 is night and day. A lot of bold decisions were made by Creative Assembly that, in my opinion, don't work at all, which makes it so frustrating that Rome 2 is the base of all the recent Total War games. Rome 2 both simplified and complicated things, and everything it complicated turned into an absolute nuisance to fucking deal with, rather than adding an intuitive layer of gameplay and complexity. Shogun 2's complexity and depth actually come from its simplicity. We see this in its unit roster, its buildings, its technology and government systems. There isn't really a lot to it. There are so many micro decisions to be made that make things really interesting and they keep you coming back. Let's begin comparing these three games with point 1, the building system. In Shogun 2, every province has a set of buildings that will always be there. This also means they can almost always be upgraded. Empire building in Shogun 2 is fun at every stage of the game because you almost always never have the money to upgrade everything in a single turn. However, unlike in the other games, there's also always something to build. You're constantly making decisions about where to allocate your funds, and you're constantly being rewarded for it. Regardless of how optimal your decisions are, there's a clear impact felt within the game as each turn flies by. The mid-game moment of transporting your newly recruited elite soldiers across an upgraded system of roads is the culmination of many minor decisions that have been made up to that point. Rome 2's system is far more limited, but it makes up for it by being fucking annoying. You do have to make tough decisions about what buildings to build since your slots are so limited. However, as been discussed by people far smarter than me, the reality is that there's only ever one decision to be made after playing the game for even just a couple of hours. Since Rome will punish you with things like squalor and public order, optimal building patterns emerge pretty quickly. Even players that don't look online for these builds are guided into managing public order and squalor so carefully. The punishment for poor building management is too severe to have fun or to experiment while building, leaving you with one choice, just fucking avoid rebellions. This makes it harder and less enjoyable to explore Rome's building trees. The punishment for mismanagement in Shogun 2 is that you could have been more efficient. The punishment for mismanagement in Rome is that you may as well restart the game. While Attila doubled down on mechanics that frankly served to annoy the user rather than challenge them, Warhammer broke free of this. Barely any buildings in Warhammer carry a negative penalty. You're instead free to build whatever you want. This really allows for some regions to have some legitimate experimentation and diversity, but unfortunately problems from the Rome system still carry over. After my first campaign, it's pretty clear each minor settlement would have 3 buildings: money, walls and public order. This is the same for every faction in the game besides hordes. That is the only decision that I can rationally take. There's no highways I can build for armies, there's no passive income building to invest in, nothing. If every region had some sort of locked income building like Shogun's farms, the extra slot would really help diversify the buildings of small provinces. Alright, so is Warhammer's system good or bad? For buildings at least, simply removing penalties from the Rome system was good enough for me to come to terms with it. I still think the Shogun system's superior, but they clearly learn from their mistakes to make for a better middle ground. Dealing with squalor or sanitation is not enjoyable to me. I don't find it to be a fun challenge. Warhammer's simplicity means less time in the building menu, and when you are in that menu, you're usually making decisions about the military anyway, ensuring high-tier unit recruitment and building up defences. The game's about war, not sewage management. If Three Kingdoms had to learn anything from Warhammer, it would be to continue the idea of building being painless. Ideally, I'd like a return to the Shogun building system, but with the Warhammer region and province capital system as well. That's pretty interesting. The second system that falls completely flat is the rigid nature of armies introduced in Rome 2. Being unable to split armies, being unable to recruit units without a general, means you're unable to make as many decisions as otherwise possible. A strategy game is all about decisions. There's so many fun tricks to the Shogun system, like rushing forward with cavalry, being able to leave proper garrisons without losing half your fucking army. When an enemy navy invasion attacks the heart of your empire, you have this beautiful bullshit fucking scramble where you muster units from every province, and there's a really fun attempt at holding the line and building a local relief force, and managing that front just becomes a game in of itself. There's a greater emphasis in army positioning with the Rome system, but ultimately it's the same problem as the building system. There's only ever one right answer. Taking choice away from the user can be a powerful tool in changing how things work, but the decision was just a lazy way to deal with AI problems. This bullshit fucking system has one saving grace, and that it is perfect for Warhammer. This system really allows Total War to finally become an RPG. It makes sense that you can't just muster random forces because RPGs are just such a character-driven genre. Of course, the only people worthy of leading my armies are Karl Franz or Old Mate Metalface, because there's no place for Man of the Hour events if you're not carrying a 10-foot Warhammer. The quests, the leveling system, the lore traits, they're all just such fantastic additions to the series. Finding a magic ring that gives your general a fireball spell is fucking awesome. My only real gripe about this specific point is that Warhammer did not go far enough, and it really failed to capitalize on this element. Warhammer 1 gets a pass on that failure, but Warhammer 2 really could have done a lot to evolve the series and create the first real Total War RPG. A few features I thought of pretty quickly was a roguelike system where armies are teleported to zones, almost like a Super Mario world where they can fight multiple battles without replenishment, while getting rewarded, getting some unique units. There's a lot of fuck shit Warhammer 2 could have done, but it really just felt like a faction pack to me. The addition of riots and ruin looting were good ideas, but they're certainly not enough to justify a $60 sequel. As it stands, the Warhammer franchise remains as a simple Total War, instead of an RPG Total War. Depending on how Three Kingdoms goes, it doesn't matter to me if it's gritty and realistic, or if it's full on crazy as shit Dynasty Warriors. What matters is if they commit to the depth and strategy, or to RPG mechanics. Right now, Warhammer games are in the middle of this, and while Warhammer 1 was sort of new, Warhammer 2 is just boring because of it. Three Kingdoms needs to commit to be interesting, and I think players that stick to history or fantasy, they're sort of missing the point of what makes these games fun and different. To use Paradox Interactive Games as an example, in Victoria 2 Racism Simulator, I can fill my infantry divisions with dirty communists and slaves while I keep my British soldiers safe as artillerymen in the reserves. I can dictate their wages, I can mobilise the country, I can fiddle with my army composition. There's so many choices to make. In Crusader Kings 2, also Racism Simulator, I click the raise army button, and that's it? But that game has so many RPG elements, and it has entirely different mechanics that allow for those elements to impact every corner of that game, and it is just as fun as the other one. When you play as a different character in Crusader Kings 2, the whole structure of the game can really change. I don't feel this impact enough in Warhammer. So ideally, I would prefer if Three Kingdoms had an army system like Shogun, especially if it ends up being a realistic game. Realistic Total Wars need depth, and annoying campaign mechanics don't provide that. Giving people the freedom to be creative provides that. If Three Kingdoms is an RPG, I'll have more room to accept it. If CA uses the system in a creative way and uses the simplicity to create depth elsewhere, we could get a really unique Total War. Warhammer still feels a lot like Rome, it's just that it's so much nicer to play, it removes so much of the hassle that game implemented. So let's move on to point number 3, faction diversity. Faction diversity is definitely shaped by each game and what that game's trying to accomplish. Shogun 2's single roster is divisive, but I think it's clear how biased I am towards that game. I really think the single roster was a great decision. They left so much development time for balance and to perfect the battle system, and every other part of the game really. It's the only Total War with a real multiplayer system. Rome 2 was my second Total War, and I have to say the concept of faction variety was pretty spoiled by my experiences with that game. Every faction had specialties, but for the most part, they didn't feel that different to me. There were factions with hoplites and factions without them. That was about it. The fact that the battle system was completely fucked at launch, along with the rest of the game, might have had a lot to do with that, but I would have nuked every faction besides Rome if it meant more polish on release. So I actually had doubts about Warhammer's factions. I didn't really believe they'd be able to pull it off. I'm glad to say I was wrong. The base 4 factions really show it off the best. The slow stone wall of the dwarves against the mobile and monstrous green skins. The familiar Empire is great and diverse. They have a lot of options like a Shogun 2 faction would. And the vampires are delightful. The never routing mechanic was something I was super excited for. The raise dead mechanic in the campaign gives them an unreal momentum. And it just makes them so much fun to play in battles and on the campaign map. So yeah, faction unit variety is what Warhammer really brings to the table. It does it really well. Every single race is worth playing at least once, which can't be said for Rome or Shogun's factions in my opinion. However, I also have to say it hasn't been done perfectly. I think there are a few factions that overlap a bit too much. I don't think enough of those factions commit to their strengths or to their weaknesses enough, which makes the variety feel a bit empty once you've played for a while, and it's a big factor in one of my later points. Eventually, despite stat differences, you'll end up using basic infantry the same way no matter what faction you're playing. You're going to use cavalry the same way. You're going to use archers and monsters the exact same way. This is probably the biggest shame, and yet it still provided a lot of fun, replayability, and most importantly, enjoyment for me. Warhammer also introduces magic and monsters, though none of the monsters are as horrifying as Rome 2, but they're a fun addition. They make the game stand out, but they're really not a new tool to use tactically. The Varghulf is a Rome 2 elephant, the trolls, the giants, the mammoths, the dragon lizard Kolek fucks, they're all just elephants really. They don't give you more options on the battlefield. However, they do give you diversity. Diversity in stats, in appearance, and in weight, which does have an impact in the charge mechanic. Monsters are just really fun to use and they're a good addition to the game, but despite how cool they look, they don't change things too much. Magic is also far from new. Generals have been able to buff and debuff units for so long. Only since the addition of Warhammer 2's Big Frog Dude has a spell even come close to or met the sheer firepower of Fall of the Samurai's naval bombardments. You could destroy armies with that thing. It was seriously devastating. The trick, and it's one I enjoy, is that Warhammer has so many different ways you can utilize magic and monsters and infantry, even if they aren't that different to what we've used before, even if they aren't that different between themselves. Orc infantry isn't that different to human infantry in how they're used, but they do have different strengths and weaknesses, which make them fun to fight against and keeps things interesting. It changes how your army composition will ideally look like, and ultimately gives you more decisions to make, which is always fantastic. It's all a really good step in the right direction. Going from Shogun 2 to Warhammer, whichever one you prefer, will feel refreshingly different, and the two work so well together when you're on a Total War binge. So what can Three Kingdoms do here? I don't think CA should be afraid of doing another single roster. Shogun 2 is amazing. There needs to be something seriously new on the battlefield to make up for that. More unit formations, more unit abilities, make the soldiers realistic, and generals fucking crazy. I don't care personally as long as it feels different to Warhammer and different to Shogun. I want a real sequel instead of seeing the same systems, but we're in China now. Warhammer 2's mistake was continuing to rely on the diversity that made Warhammer 1 so special. Continued to rely on simplified systems that were easy to use. This all probably sounds like a good thing, so you're probably wondering what the fuck I'm talking about. Well, faction and unit variety, it looks a lot like this curve. Every time a faction is released, it just feels less and less new, and the overlapping problem I said earlier gets stronger and stronger. We're really experiencing diminishing returns here. At some point, variety just stops being interesting in of itself. A new game needs to bring something to the table, and Warhammer 1 already brought diversity that we hadn't seen before, and with all the DLC and free DLC that game has, problems with faction overlap are getting bigger and bigger. A sequel needs to bring change, be it transitioning from muskets to swords or swords to dragons. It just needs to change the way we interact with the game, and change the decisions that we're making. Warhammer made some cool steps towards becoming an RPG. Warhammer 2 largely committed to being more of the same. What hurts this even more is the terrible quality of the campaign mechanics for the new factions. High Elves diplomacy is the most useless thing I could have imagined. The Skaven food mechanic is so annoyingly Rome 2-esque, gave me PTSD. The Lizardmen have the never-before-seen quest to conquer more land, at least the Dark Elves have public order choices to make with slaves. Even in the variety we're being given, the quality simply isn't good enough. These faction traits don't explore any possible RPG element, they double down on the standard Total War mechanics instead of doing something crazy or unique. Warhammer 2 is just more of the same to its very core. We're still waiting for improvements for Mortal Empires, which is just a bigger version of 2 games you already have. We're waiting on Norsca, a faction that exists in another game. We're waiting on Tomb Kings when we have so many factions already. I get that it's all sort of part of the charm, but I can't help but no longer be excited about it. Warhammer should be what Crusader Kings 2 is to Victoria 2, but instead it's far too similar. And I know that that's exactly as advertised. It's what I thought I wanted, but none of the factions in that game were as fun as Norsca or Bretonnia or even the vampire counts. They all just kind of fell flat for me. I do like the Skaven Things from Below ability, that's pretty cool. And the character trait, level up screen, pretty much every legendary lord in Warhammer 2 has a lot more flavour than the Warhammer 1 lords. But it's just not enough. We are still waiting on more information, but I'm afraid Thrones of Britannia is going to be a sidestep sequel to Attila, and I don't want Three Kingdoms to follow Warhammer 2's steps. Warhammer 1 is a game that refined every simplification made from Rome 2's era. It is smooth and it is refreshing, but it's just not the gold standard, and copying it isn't good enough. To go over my 3 points, here's what Three Kingdoms needs to do. It needs to have a building system that gives the player options instead of a headache. It's not a key part of the game and we need to stop pretending like it is. This goes for the province manager screen from Attila as well. It's really fucking annoying. The army system is tied to being historical or fantasy driven. If we're an RPG, fine, give us RPG options to make up for the loss of strategy and freedom. But if we're not an RPG, then stop babying us with these limitations and let us make mistakes. I'm not going to reload a save in Shogun if I lose half my army from my own mistake, but if I lose my whole army in Warhammer, because that's the only thing the game lets me lose, I'm gonna have to load a save or restart the campaign. And finally, factions and battles need to feel new. Variety is powerful, but it isn't everything. It's the choice between $10 shoes from Big W or some pair of hype beast Yeezys. I've been using hammer and anvil tactics in Total War for every single game ever released. I want something that really revolutionizes how the game is played. And if Three Kingdoms doesn't follow the RPG route, I really hope Warhammer 2 DLC or Warhammer 3 follows this path. There's so much room to maneuver with that franchise. It's my second favourite Total War. I just really hope that it ends up being something special instead of a copy-paste highlight reel. Thanks for watching, guys. Let me know what you think. I'm happy to talk with people that disagree with me. I'm sure a lot of you will. Let's hope the best for Three Kingdoms, and see you next time.